This is my final submission for MSc Music and Sound for Film and Games at the University of Hertfordshire. I'm Ian Henderson, and in this presentation I will look to outline the aims of this project, the context for its creation, and some of the techniques used in order to achieve the final result. This project started with the simple aim of learning to use Wise and the techniques involved in integration with this middleware, having used Fmod in the past. I also wanted to take the opportunity to learn more about Unreal Engine and how the two function together, as well as integrating existing assets into an Unreal environment to make my own original game. In addition to this, I wanted to utilize original music and sound assets in order to create a unique experience for the player that uses sound to drive and motivate player interaction. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of how the game was made and the techniques were approached, I believe it's necessary to address some of the context around the unique direction of my project and why it took the form it did. Let's look at some inspirations both in the realms of sound, the realms of gameplay, and the overlap between the two. This is 2008's The Blob, the soundtrack for which was composed by John Guskett. The player takes the role of a revolutionary blob who seeks to repaint a city from which all colour has been taken away. The game's soundtrack is deeply tied to the overall experience, with each colour in the game being tied to different instrument banks which are triggered when the player paints a building. This gives the player direct audio feedback for their actions and helps them feel like they are shaping a part of the soundtrack. This was a big inspiration when planning out my project and thinking about the directions that I wanted to take my music system, and how a non-linear music system could be used to reward player interaction as well as provide feedback. Here we have another 2008 title, Spore, the soundtrack for which was composed by Brian Eno and Cliff Martinez. In Spore, players create, evolve, and control their own alien race from microorganism to spacefaring civilization. A key feature of Spore's gameplay is its extensive character customization screens, and it's in these that the music system takes center stage. It could be said that Spore's music system was created with very different aims to that of The Blob's, prioritizing subtlety to a much greater extent. It could also be said, however, that they have similar goals in their desire to respond directly to player feedback, adopting different musical ideas in response to the actions that players take. While I knew I wasn't going to be making music systems as ambitious or expansive as those of The Blob or Spore, I wanted to keep both of their approaches in mind while conceiving the music system for my game. I decided to focus on the elements of responding to player interaction, keeping things tonally interesting, and driving gameplay forward. It's from here that ideas started to develop in terms of the other side of things, using Unreal to create an original game, and for that, gameplay was needed. Let's have a look at some examples of games that have inspired the gameplay for my project. A never-ending corridor loop, an ever-present ghostly antagonist, a cryptic story told through puzzles and the environment. This is PT. PT, or Playable Teaser, heavily inspired my project, as can be seen in the looping nature of the environment, the horror elements present, and the delivery of story through notes and visual cues as the game is played. Initially, this project existed potentially more in a horror space during its conception. However, as time went on, I decided to take things in a more meta and humorous direction in some elements, deciding rather than to tell the stories that are often delved into in horror games, something a bit more reflective on the creation of the project itself. Along these themes, we move on to our next title.
Stanley found himself unable to move for the longest time.
The Stanley Parable was written and developed by Davey Wreden and William Pugh. It was originally fully released in 2013 and uses simple gameplay mechanics to tell stories, covering themes such as choice in video games, the relationship between the creators of games and the players, and also the wider implications of fate and predetermination. The approach to storytelling, humor, and use of audio in this game deeply inspired my project, and these were themes that I definitely wanted to carry forward into my own work. However, as a student, I wanted to focus more on the relationship between the creator and the end product, the work that they're making. It also showed that a lot can be done with very simple gameplay mechanics. Honourable mentions in this category also go to the genre-bending and ever-developing narrative style of Inscription, as well as its approach to redefining gameplay and approaches in the roguelite and deck-building genres, and the off-the-cuff slapstick humor and striking visuals of jazz punk, which also incorporates similarly simple gameplay mechanics, but creates a very unique experience out of them.
We've much business to discuss. Basically, we need you to infiltrate the Soviet consulate.
How actually did I go about trying to achieve the lofty goals I had set myself, both as a student learning new processes for the first time, but also as someone engaging in experimental and artistic endeavors? In this next section, I will discuss some of the techniques used both in Wise and Unreal to bring some of my ideas hopefully to life. But before we begin, please give this a thought. A door isn't either open or shut. It must be either open and then shut, and then opened and then shut. In this way, what is called an oscillation is produced. A wave is a correlated collection of oscillations, and music is a collection of waves. So, doors make music. Or at least in my game they do. In Game Design Fundamentals Rules of Play, Salen and Zimmerman outlined the idea of meaningful play. This emerges from the relationship between player action and system outcome, and consists, in their words, of two components: discernible and integrated action. The result of a game action being discernible is simply that it is communicated to the player in a perceivable way. The idea of integrated action is that their action has an outcome in the larger context of the game. We'll come back to integrated later, fittingly. But in a game where the player spends so much of their time opening and closing doors, the result of this should be discernible. And so I decided to make it discernible by a door being open or closed, contributing towards the game's soundtrack. The creation of this system was actually quite simple in Wise. All it took was creating a music playlist container under the interactive music hierarchy, and creating a music segment containing each of the layers of my piece of music as I wanted them to be split. These are technically triggered all at the same time. However, all components but one are muted from the start of the game. For each of the music components, a voice volume RTPC was then linked to an in-game parameter, which was then linked to each of the doors. In Unreal, all it takes is the triggering of event open on the door to be false, and for the door handle to be opened, the RTPC value is set to 1, and the music layer is introduced. If the door is closed, the RTCC value is set to 0. While devising these systems and deciding overall what I actually wanted the game to be, I landed on the idea that really the game is a work in progress, and that as a player enters a room, a door shuts behind them, and I, as the creator of the game, am following them around, shutting these doors and leaving post-it notes as memories, thoughts, ideas, alluding to the direction of the overall game. Returning to the idea of integrated action, I also wanted this to be consistent and important to the overall direction of the story. I didn't want for a post-it note to just spawn and go away, and I decided that as the house would continue from loop to loop and iteration to iteration, that the post-it notes that the player had found had to be consistent as well. I also realized that the spawning of a post-it note, a purely visual asset, may not be as discernible to the player as it was to me, and so a system had to be put in place that truly highlighted this to the player. First, we'll take a look at the system behind the spawning of the post-it notes. Let's have a look at one of the simpler post-it note triggers, the bathroom 2 trigger from iteration 2. On the player hitting the box trigger within the bathroom, the branch condition checks for whether they have previously hit this. If not, the door is closed behind them, the slider on the door is locked, and then the post-it note is spawned. In addition to this, a sound is played on a delay from Wise. We can then look at how this trigger feeds into the wider system, creating that integrated action that is important to meaningful play. If we find the public variable for whether that bathroom was triggered in our third house blueprint, we can see that if the case is yes, it will spawn the corresponding post-it note in the new iteration. This is true for all of the post-it notes in the game, as you can see, creating an exponentially larger system of increasingly growing variables. Now we've got our post-it notes spawning, how do we make them obvious to the player? And particularly in this case, how do we make them make sound? In order to achieve this without requiring any additional interaction from the player, I decided to use a line trace from the player's point of view. This is essentially a line fired out like a laser from the camera that is scanning or trying to detect different objects or materials. In this case, it is trying to detect post-it notes, or the destructible tag which has been assigned to them. Put simply, depending on whether the line trace is true or false at any given time, we create variables which state whether the player is looking at the object in question or not. In the case that the player is looking at the post-it note, this event is triggered. From here, an emissive material in yellow is set to trigger, as well as a post event from Wise. This pulls from a bank of randomized narrative voice clips specific to each of the post-it notes in question.
Iteration 1, the ideal.
This is also true of the paintings in the game, which have their own soundscapes attached to when the player looks at them. To keep audio from getting messy in this respect, however, there is a slight difference which, when the player stops looking at these pictures, the sound stops playing. So, on reflection, did my reach exceed my grasp on this project? Of course it did. I think the number of goals I set myself heading into this and the number of new techniques and approaches that I had to learn during the course of the project made it so that the scope was so huge and that there were so many elements that perhaps I would have wanted to pay more attention to and spend more time on that I didn't have the opportunity to, simply because there were so many components and moving parts that I had to learn as I was going along. I think in this respect, however, there's a great success in terms of my original aims, in terms of learning Wise, learning Unreal, and really adapting the project and the shape it was taking as I learned new skills and as the project went along. I believe that I would have had the opportunity to delve deeper into Wise and particularly its visual logic system had I not been already so engrossed with Unreal's visual logic and the programming that I'd done in there in the game space to make all of that work. However, I believe that I did delve into the basics, at least, of Wise. I feel much better equipped using the software now than I did when I started the project. On the Unreal side of things, I think I've equipped myself with a great set of skills that will make me really valuable as a hiring prospect, and particularly in the indie space where there is less manpower, there are less people to do more tasks, and having someone like myself who is an audio professional but understands the ins and outs of an engine and the whole integration process now would be really valuable to a team in the creation of an indie project. Overall, I believe that I achieved my goal of making something unique that draws upon contemporaries and other works that have come before in the space. I think that hopefully it contributes in some way to the canon of experimental music and audio systems in games, and helps further drive the relation between gameplay and audio and the interaction between the two. I always knew that I wasn't going to be making the next Stanley Parable or anything like that. I think that as a student project, it stands fairly well, and I think I can be proud of the work that I've achieved in terms of I took existing assets, as I aimed to do, and built something original nearly from scratch, coding a lot of the processes in game with no knowledge of Unreal's systems before starting this project. I think it's a classic situation of having learned to do all this stuff on the fly, and during the course of this project, were I to attempt it again, I could achieve something twice as good in half the time. But that's the learning process, and the project adapted and changed as I went along. It was iterative, much like the layout of the game itself. And I think that that's really valuable, and understanding that process and that relationship will be really valuable to me in my career. In conclusion, I think this game, Paper Prototype, lives up to its name. It's a prototype. It's a work in progress. It is narratively and visually and gameplay-wise quite chaotic, but also quite straightforward. And I hope that it really serves me as a great learning experience going forward, and just a awesome stepping stone and building block to the rest of my career, hopefully in game audio.